Okay, and for our next presenter, we're joined by Amanda Butler from Minnesota. Should be on. So we're joined by Amanda Butler from Minnesota State University Moorhead, who will be sharing with us last call investigations of a ghost town saloon.
Hello. So thanks for having me. We're going to chat a little bit about another saloon era, or actually just a 1900s saloon and restaurant. So overall, alcohol consumption in the upper Midwest in general has a pretty long and problematic history. And this particularly rings true in the Fargo-Moorhead area of North Dakota and Minnesota. Maybe, there we go. There we go. So while this talk will center on our investigations at Winnipeg Junction, which is this ghost town saloon in small rural Minnesota, our initial interest about this site actually stems from the body history of and boozy history of Fargo-Moorhead. So I'm just want to orient you to where we're at or where we're talking about here. Winnipeg Junction is about 30 miles east of the Fargo-Moorhead metro area there. So in 1889, the state of North Dakota entered the Union as a dry state. It was actually the first state to do so. The bars and breweries operating in Fargo at the time simply picked up shop and moved across the river. So they had quickly businesses popping up along the Moorhead side of the river, and it quickly garnered Moorhead the nickname of Sin City. By 1900, more than 45 saloons were serving a population of around 3,700 people in Moorhead. That is roughly one bar per 83 people. That, of course, does not include the very dry denizens of North Dakota who were being ferried back and forth. In 2019, Dr. George Hawley of Minnesota State University Moorhead, my predecessor, conducted a phase 2 survey and monitoring of a proposed pedestrian walkway that would cut through a portion of Moorhead's infamous Saloon Row. He recovered a robust collection of materials that shed light on the complexities of drinking culture in Moorhead. We actually have a PhD student currently working on this for his dissertation, and so we'll know a lot more about kind of the collections that they recovered, but it is pretty extensive. In 2021, we were approached by a landowner who had recently heard presentations about Moorhead's boozy past. It was Dave, or we called him Buddy Norman. He explained that he owns property in a town called Winnipeg Junction, which is now a ghost town in the east end of the county, Clay County. On his property once stood an old saloon, one of 3 that actually served this very small community from 1900 to 1910. So a really nice little window. And this image here shows you a picture of Moorhead Saloon Row. And what's interesting about Saloon Row, with 45 saloons, you really get the gamut of upper class. They're a class. You have some high-end establishments when you also have some hole-in-the-wall establishments for some other denizens. So you have the whole gamut there. So again, thinking about this complex history of alcohol in our county and the potential connections, especially since the railroad connects directly Winnipeg Junction to Moorhead, I decided to excavate behind that saloon in hopes of locating the midden for a comparison to the collections that we recovered from Saloon Row in Moorhead. Just again, thinking about general drinking culture or drinking culture from a rural space perspective versus this city space. This past summer, I then led an excavation at MSUM Archaeological Field School to conduct a little saloon archaeology. This is our field school, and that's Buddy there hugging the sign. He was quite the character. So Winnipeg Junction, its entire history is wrapped around this boom and bust story of the railroad, and specifically the Northern Pacific. So the transcontinental Northern Line ran from Duluth to the Pacific Ocean, and tracks were laid through Clay County in 1871, and the entire transcontinental line was completed in 1883. So you can see this line at the top, and then shortly thereafter, numerous branches kind of popped up off of that main line. In the 1890s, there was a stiff competition very quickly amongst different railroad companies to be the first one to get a branch into Canada. And so the Northern Pacific was not going to be outdone by competition. And so they very quickly and very hastily built a line that connected off their main branch, which was led to the name Winnipeg Junction. And they placed this branch in what they quote, the decidedly prettiest place on the line, aka they did not have geologists surveying this line. This will come back to haunt them. So Winnipeg Junction was then platted in 1897 and it quickly grew. And you can see in the red outline here, that's Buddy's property. He owns most of the second block, most of Front Street, which was where a lot of different establishments were built. The yellow is our excavation units there. So this town quickly evolved into a booming village. So dozens of railroad workers flew in. It became a main railroad hub with a 3-stall roundhouse, an elevator, a water tank, and a depot. The town quickly grew exponentially and soon boasted 2 hotels, 3 saloons, 2 stores, a stockyard, a school, and 2 churches. So not quite as many churches as saloons, but just about. So this image here shows Front Street looking to the southeast, and you can see the 3 saloons I have highlighted there. Our quarry was Ole Gold's Saloon, the biggest there on the end. He also had Molstead Saloon and Metherell Saloon, and you can see they get smaller as you go down the street. So Ole's was seemingly the nicest establishment in town. The town itself peaked at about 260 residents, and most of the residents seemed to be immigrant settlers, most of whom were of Scandinavian descent. There seems to be some type of heavy Swedish influence in the town, as one of the churches was specifically a Swedish church. Now, Ole, he is Norwegian, but his brother-in-law and his extended family were all Swedish. So this is, again, Front Street, but looking the opposite direction. So now you can get a better look at Metherell Saloon, which is kind of that hole in the wall saloon we're talking about, Molstead's, and then Ole's. Now, one of the things you also notice is around the 1890s, branding became a thing. And some of these saloons now have national branding on them, only 2 of them. Molstead's is branded with Schlitz beer, and Ole's, if you saw in the earlier image, was branded with golden, I can't remember now, it's off the top of my head, maybe it'll come back. But anyway, branding was a thing, and they had branding up on these 2 establishments in this small town. Now, the hastily built track that Northern Pacific put in actually ended up costing them significant amounts of money because, again, geologists were not the surveyors there. So what happens in 1906, the NP announced that it would be moving the line 1 mile to the north of Winnipeg Junction, essentially cutting off this booming town. The citizens were very upset, understandably, and they were trying to ride this blossoming public animosity towards railroad monopolies and sued the Northern Pacific to stay. It did drag out in court for some time, and it made national headlines all over the country, but they were ultimately unsuccessful. And you can see these headlines here, the notice that it was moving, and then you have the Northern Pacific offered $30,000 in settlement, and they refused, and but it didn't matter in the end. It's still, they moved the railroad. So what were the issues? The issues were pretty significant. There's 3 big ones. The first one is a steep grade coming out of the Red River Valley due to the eastern shorelines of ancient glacial Lake Agassiz. So it required an additional engine to come and help pull the trains up out of the valley, which was a costly and time-consuming venture. Then you had the second issue where they just quickly had cut trestles across the very winding Buffalo River. Those are all cut banks, which were eventually becoming a problem. And then the third one was a mile just to the east of Winnipeg Junction, where it was actually very swampy ground, which kept causing the tracks to sink and required a lot of maintenance to maintain. So the town itself voted to incorporate in 1900, and by 1910, it voted to unincorporate. And by 1909, all of the structures had been sold and or moved out of Winnipeg Junction. And this included Ole Goal in his saloon. He sold his building and would then subsequently became a full-time farmer or finished his life as a full-time farmer. So this brings us to our excavations. This is what it looks like today. The majority of Winnipeg Junction is now Buddy's beautiful garden. It's actually one of the nicest excavations I've ever gotten to work in, with only the old ticket office still standing on Front Street. It's now a private residence. We ended up running a full 6-week field school out there. We conducted over 60 exploratory shovel tests, not just behind Ole Goal Saloon, but we also, with permission of the local landowners next door, we also were looking for some potential trash bins of the other 2 saloons. We ended up opening up 12 excavation units behind Ole Goal Saloon, and we did identify 4 pit features, 2 of which were very deep trash pits. And here's the outline of where ideally Ole Goal Saloon and restaurant would be, right in the middle of Buddy's garlic patch. The first pit is an unusually deep pit for historic era. There was lots of stuff in it, but it was just very deep and stratified. But this pit was, again, just behind the saloon. And what was interesting about it was the amount of bottle caps we recovered. So again, analysis is still ongoing. It's very slow. We only have a handful of students who are working on this, and we recovered a lot of material. But we did find a minimum of this is still counting, but a minimum of 50 bottle caps just from this feature. And again, surprising all of us, we kind of assumed that the presence of bottle caps kind of skewed the timeline of this pit in indicating that it was disturbed. Again, I'm a Mississippianist by trade, so historic features and historic timelines are still new to me up here in the Midwest. But ultimately, we found out that obviously bottle caps were, the crown cork was patented in 1892 by William Painter and quickly spread throughout the Midwest. In fact, fun fact, King Gillette, who the inventor of the disposable razor, worked for William Painter during this time period when he invented these disposable crown corks. And that kind of fascinating factoid was really interesting to my students, and we kind of continued to think about this ongoing discussion of the earliest examples of American consumerism and throwaway culture just from this one pit. So we're still learning a little bit more about that, but the pit we really cared about was the saloon pit. So we did successfully hit a very large trash pit with saloon debris and restaurant debris, and it was the largest pit feature that we recovered. Oh, there we go. Grain belt. That was grain belt is the branding on Ole Goals. So the pit itself measured 2.9 meters wide and 1.4 meters deep. It's very large. We recovered whole and broken bottles from the saloon. We also included recovered a number of medicinal bottles, barrel remnants, farm equipment, clothing, and food residues from the formerly attached restaurant. We also recovered the original shovel that dug this pit. At the very bottom, it had snapped, the handle had snapped off, and they apparently just left it as is and said, this is deep enough. So we found that as well. Now you can see in that other picture, we had a massive amount of things just sticking out from that profile wall. And it did present some issues for my students, and then we had to be creative about how we were going about excavating underneath and around this profile wall. This in itself was nicknamed, this is an old pull behind horse-drawn plow or horse-drawn mower. And my students we nicknamed it in the pit there, the jaws of death. We did, like I said, my students were able to recover quite a few whole bottles. We have whole crocks there in that image as well. Barware or stemware, and additional bottles or broken bottles that have a lot of interesting labels on them. That one on the right is from the Northern Brewery. But we also found some really interesting ones that still had the label on it. Looks like this is an old version of this. I haven't updated that. But this Hennessy bottle is an example of what we thought it could be. You can still see the H and the E. It does have some grapes along the top, but Hennessy has stars, not grapes. So it's probably some type of brandy or other type of fortified wine is what we're thinking. We also found a lot of gin bottles or gin identified things. We found this label of Booth's Old Tom Gin. This is an example of what the bottle would have looked like. In addition to the barware, the stemware, like I said, we did find a lot of medicinal bottles. And as far as we know, Ole Gols was not a residence. He had his own house elsewhere. And we haven't found anything that said that he had borders, but it is a very large building. And so there shouldn't really be a whole lot of domestic items. And so looking in these, some of these pharmaceutical bottles anyway, some of them have to do with or are advertised for liver and upset stomach, which you might find in a bar or a restaurant, but we have found quite a few and we are looking into that a little bit more. We have found a lot of bone and fauna, some butchered bone, all things that you would associate with restaurant refuse, serving dishes. Like I said, a lot of crockery coming out of here as well. We did find an entire layer of eggshell, which is interesting. And one of the biggest most rewarding aspects of our project has been this wonderful community experience. So with the aid of our host, Buddy, word really quickly spread about our investigations, and some descendant community and family members reached out and they were actually able to stop by during our excavations. One of these special connections was the last surviving daughter of Theodore, or Teddy Johnson, Ole Gol's brother-in-law and the proprietor of the attached restaurant. So she was particularly moved by kind of touching these artifacts and seeing the photos and just being so near a remnant of her father's legacy and history. And up here in the middle, this is Arlene looking at artifacts and looking at the pit. And then at the top middle there, that is the only surviving image we have inside the saloon itself. In white, there is Teddy Johnson, and to the right is Ole Gol with a beer in hand. So ultimately, this project has been a really rewarding experience. It's continuing to look into this, but ultimately alcohol really has shaped or impacted not really just the history of Winnipeg Junction, but the overall settler history of Clay County. And while alcohol initially shaped our first research questions, our work in Winnipeg Junction has really inspired a lot of different questions into new forms of growth in a boom and bust railroad town, and what it actually says about large-scale projects on infrastructure, immigration, vice, and new forms of consumerism and material waste. So with that, I will end here and I'll open it up for questions if anybody has any. Were there a lot of surface features or It is littered with surface scatter, and it was actually surprising because it was littered with surface scatter that really looks to date to that 1900 to 1910 window, but people still lived there residentially until the Depression. So we do have Depression era stuff just below that. But because we called it the Buddy zone instead of a traditional plow zone, it was Buddy's garden zone. He tills this up and is bringing a lot of that to the surface. But yeah, you can't walk anywhere out there without stumbling on whole bottle tops and all kinds of stuff.
You mentioned that there seemed to be like the medicinal bottles that you would associate maybe with the residents rather than with a restaurant or a bar. Would there have been like a row of residences like behind that? Like, is there another street just behind the bar street?
Yeah, if you remember the plat map, just directly behind the alleyway is residences. And so are they using this open pit to just throw garbage into? It's something we're definitely looking into. We're also very curious about, it is thinking about male and female spaces. Traditionally, females are not allowed, women aren't necessarily in saloon spaces. And that's something we didn't see in Moorhead. In this rural space, is that something maybe we're seeing more of, because we did find some women's shoes, some clothing items in this pit as well. And maybe some of this medicinal items could have been associated with women as well. So still looking into some of those questions, but yeah.